Hmm. The screen is like so bright. I'm just looking at the OBS thing and it looks like I'm like glowing. I don't like it. So hopefully once I finish doing these post things on like my Discord and whatnot, then I can use like a darker background and then it won't like shine in my face as much. Okay. Let's get out of here. That away. See, like now it doesn't look as bad because now I have a like the background I have, like my wallpaper, is a darker picture. Like it's not like bright white. It's not like white, so it's not this. This is like it's not just like this bright light now, right? So maybe this one's a little bit high. Yeah, it's a little bit high. I want it too blue. I have a blue light back here that like it's supposed to contrast with a lot of the regular lighting. And of course, like the other thing too is that like it'll start getting darker throughout the day, because like right now it's like 3:05, right? And so because of that, it's still a little bit light out. And because of that, then there's like some light coming to the room. Mm. Okay. Should be all that. Just got a little bit late on the start here, so we're actually going to start very soon. Just wait a little bit longer. So you guys come in here. Hmm. You know, it's kind of like those movie theater things where like you start with a full cup of like your drink or whatever, but by the time you actually start the program, you're already most of the way through. I mean, that's definitely true with like popcorn when you go to a movie, right? Which is a good reason why you shouldn't actually buy coffee and a drink, because then you end up just loading yourself at the beginning of the movie, and the worst part is when you have the bathroom urge during the movie, because the hope is that like you sit and watch through the whole thing, right? But if you end up drinking your whole drink before the movie even starts, well, basically that increases the chance that you'll miss parts of the end of the movie because you're gonna have to go to the bathroom at some point, right? So, and I mean that's true right now. Like I already drank like half of my fruit punch here, so and like the main point of it is that like I have something to drink, when I have my breaks as I read, but likelihood of that happening is pretty low because I'm gonna drink the whole thing before then. So anyway, enough of me rambling. Hello and welcome to the streaming Parson reads the book of Genesis. And as you may read in the description, I am at the end of Genesis. I am reading from chapter 47 to 50. 50 is the last chapter. And so we will be ending my book read, if you will, with of 2020 with Genesis. Well, I'll probably do like some kind of nativity related thing. Probably just read like the Luke 2 account of Jesus' birth or whatever next week. So I might just do that. Something simple for next week's reading. But for this week, we're going to be finishing Genesis. And so that would be a nice way to finish off the year and then start something different in January. Though I've not decided on what book I want to read yet. Anyway, today I'll be reading from Genesis chapter 47 to the end. I'll be using the New International Version, or NIV, if you want to follow. Just use, Bible app, Bible Gateway. I mean, you can get the Bible for free on the internet. Like, just use it, right? Like, there's no reason not to use it. So, yeah, if you want to follow along, I'm using the New International Version. Before we start, I'm just going to start us off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll just dive right into it. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And I pray that as we read your word, you would reveal more of yourself and your desire for our lives as we read today. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Alrighty. I guess I should start with a preface just a little bit before, because oddly enough, chapter 47 is a continuation of chapter 46. So the last few chapters was basically what happened was after Joseph had become, basically second in command in Egypt, the famine that was supposed to like scorch the world for 7 years had finally shown up. And so while Egypt had food, other places like Canaan did not have any. So because this was the case, we go back to Joseph's brothers who, live in Canaan, and they have to go to Egypt to get food. And unbeknownst to them, Joseph is the guy they have to deal with. And so Joseph, knowing who they are, because I guess he recognizes them after like basically 20 years, he decides to kind of screw around with them for a bit. And then eventually he kind of goes a little too far with wanting to keep Benjamin for himself. And this forces the brothers to, confess and reveal everything about the past and all that. And so Joseph, being moved by his brother's change of heart, he decides to reveal himself to them and tells them that, hey, you know what? Egypt is plentiful. There's the famine in Canaan is going to keep going for 5 more years. Yada, yada, yada. You guys can move in with me. And so the brothers go and they pick up Israel / Jacob, and they're going to bring him to Egypt. Yeah, that's basically where we were. That's where chapter 46 ended. And so chapter 47 just continues some conversation between them as they plan to move Joseph's family from Canaan to Egypt. Chapter 47. So Joseph went and told Pharaoh, my father and brothers, with their flocks, herds, and everything they own, have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen. He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. So Pharaoh asked the brothers, what is your occupation? Your servants are shepherds, they replied to Pharaoh. Sorry. There you go. just as our fathers were. They also told the Pharaoh, "We have come to live here for a while, because the famine is severe in Canaan, and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So please, let your servants settle in Goshen." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. So settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen, and if you know any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock." Then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" Which is a great interview question, right? "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they are not equal to the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out of his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt, and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to the number of their children. There was no food, however, in the whole region, because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. So Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. When the money of the people of Egypt and Canaan were gone, all Egypt came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? Our money is all gone." "Then bring your livestock," said Joseph, "and I will sell you food in exchange for your livestock, since your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for their horses, sheep, and goats, their cattle, and their donkeys. And Joseph brought them through that year with food in exchange for all their livestock. When that year was over, they came to him the following year, and they said, "We cannot hide from our lord the fact that since our money is gone and our livestock belongs to you, there is nothing left for our lord except our bodies and our land. Why should we perish before your eyes, we and our land as well? Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and we with all our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh. Give us seed so that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become desolate." So Joseph brought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields, because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph reduced the people to servitude, from one end of Egypt to the other. I guess that's one way to get a monopoly. However, he did not buy the land of the priest, because they received a regular allotment from Pharaoh and had food enough from the allotment Pharaoh gave them. That is why they did not sell their land. Joseph said to the people, "Now that I have bought you and your land today for Pharaoh, here is seed so that you can plant the ground. But when the crop comes in, give a fifth of it to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 you may keep as seeds for fields and as food for yourselves and for your children." "You have saved our lives," they said. May we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. We will be in bondage to Pharaoh. So Joseph established, So Joseph established it as a law concerning the land of Egypt, still in force to this day, that a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. It was only the land of the priests that did not become Pharaoh's. Now the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. Jacob lived in Egypt. Oh, now the phone's going off. And no doubt this guy's going to leave a message on the answering machine on the other, like, for some reason, this phone I have, like, each phone part has, like, a answering machine thing built in, so he's going to speak through. I'm going to mute the microphone when he does. So just give me a second. I know this is annoying, but just got to deal with it. Yeah, it's one of those annoying things because, like, with all these cordless phones, you want to spread them out around the house. But at the same time, that means anytime the phone rings, you can hear it all over. And so I just kind of have to deal with it, right? Anyway, where was I? Oh yes, verse 28. So Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for Israel to die, he called for his son Joseph and said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried." I will do as you say. "Swear to me." Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. That's chapter 47, and it's basically the life of the Hebrews settling into Egypt, as well as how bad the famine got. Because the funny thing is that, like, even though Joseph had a plan for, like, the 7 years, obviously this plan had a fair amount of holes in it, right? Because even though there were 7 years of plenty, in order to survive 7 years, you would have to basically split up the food, right? You'd have to split up 50-50 between the years of plenty and the years of famine, right? If the famine is going to be so bad, right? But if you remember a few chapters back, Joseph said only a fifth should need to be kept. But clearly that would not be enough. I mean, not just for the people of Egypt, but in case there was, trade with other places, which clearly they were open to do because, Canaanites came in to trade, and obviously, you know, Joseph's brothers, right? They were willing to just. Egypt had the open borders to allow trade, but clearly they were well less than prepared. And I mean, what did you expect, right? And so it's just one of those interesting things where why it gets as desperate as it does, and we were reading that whole part where the Egyptians were like selling everything, right, just to eat. And so what they gave all their money, probably had to pawn off a lot of like their jewelry and stuff to make extra money. On top of that, they had to give all their livestock, and how would you keep the livestock alive, right? Because the famine affects them too, obviously. And then on top of that, they had to like sell their property, and so basically it was like mortgages, essentially, right? Massive mortgages, as well as like indentured servitude, right? Basically becoming slaves. to Pharaoh, and basically Pharaoh owned everything because that's where all the money went. So it's just kind of like, I don't know. It's kind of funny that the Bible records something so awkward happening, right? Because you when you have like the Sunday school version of the story, right? It's like, well, Joseph saved Egypt, but then like you read here, it's like clearly Joseph's plan had a lot of problems and there were a lot of hardships, despite how well he thought he planned it out, right? But when you look, I mean, hindsight's only 2020, right? So you look back and clearly Joseph could have thought of more ways of preparing Egypt for this famine. Because let's be real, 1/5 is not enough, right? Because think of it this way too, like, so when it was the years of plenty, right? And assuming with as little waste as possible, you're using almost 4/5 to survive the 7 years of plenty. So when the 7 years of famine came, how did you think you were going to survive with basically 1/4 of what you were used to, right? Now you're thinking 1/4, but it was 1/5 that was stored. Well, basically, you have to think of it as they were only using 4 out of 5, right, during the 7 years of plenty, because the other 1/5 was being stored. So if you were to draw this in a pie chart, right? I'm gonna draw this out for you. Where's my paint program? Display. And so let's say there were 5 parts, right? So let's just draw 5 triangles, right? This is the 7 years of plenty. And this is the famine, right? And so there was a 5th one, right? And so the 5th one, became this, right? And so they were living on this for the 7 years of plenty and had to live on this for the 7 years of famine. So technically, this is equal to this. I mean, mathematically, we're just going to assume that because I know you can get nitpicky that my triangles here are pretty awful, but that's besides the point. But that's what I mean, that like, how could Joseph have thought that this would have been enough, right? Because before, assuming with minimal waste, they were living on this. And I mean, the trade would have still been there, but I don't know if they would have, if it was possible, there might have been more trading during the years of famine because, places like Canaan would have come over to look for food and try and purchase, right? And so this plan had it wasn't a perfect plan, right? I mean, it would not have been enough to sustain Egypt, especially for 7 years, because 7 years is a pretty long time, right? Like, let's try and, what does 7 years look like? Try to think of like, well, okay, 7 years is a really long time. That's like a video game generation, right? Like a game console, right? So we've just entered a new generation, especially with like the Xbox. What's it called? The new Xbox. If someone knows what it is, you can remind me. But like the PlayStation 5 just came out a couple weeks ago, right? So before that, we had the PlayStation 4. And the PlayStation 4's lifespan was roughly like 6-7 years before they released the PlayStation 5, right? So 7 years is a pretty long time because you can think of like all the stuff that happened with the PlayStation 4. Well, that's just one example. And I mean, you don't feel that gap as big now because I guess technology grows so much faster. But like, if you think back in like, oh man, this makes me sound super old, right? So I'll tell you a funny story where I was living when I was doing my master's degree. I was living in the school dormitories. Now, of course, when you're living in the school dormitories, most of these students are like, what, 19, 20 years old. And when I was doing my master's, I was like approaching my late 20s. So I was like 26 at the time. And so an age gap between like myself being in like 25, 26 and like a bunch of 19, 20-year olds. And this I felt so old. So I was talking with one of the guys I lived with, and we were talking about video games because of course you do. And I brought up a Super Nintendo title. I was talking about Super Mario RPG. And it's for me that's like a classic, right? That's a game I really love to play. And I was talking a bit about it, and he then said, "I have never heard of it." And that's where like I died a little bit on the inside. It's like, what do you mean you never heard of it, right? Like Super Mario RPG is a classic, dude. But this guy I was living with, he's like, never heard of it. And that 6-year gap, right? Like stuff like that would have happened in that 6-year gap. Because like, okay, when Super Mario RPG was a thing, I was probably like, well, let's see, Super Mario RPG was like relatively early 90s, a little bit later than that, something like that. And then, because Super Mario RPG came toward the end of the Super Nintendo's life, so something like, because the PlayStation was almost mid-90s, right? So it's a little bit before that. So this guy that I was living with, he was born around the time Super Mario RPG came out, whereas I was probably like in grade school already. And so, of course, like an infant's not gonna know stuff like that, right? By the time he gets into gaming, it's already well into like the next generation, like N64, PlayStation gen, right? And maybe even closer toward like the next gen after that, which would have been like GameCube and the PlayStation 2. But you know, this boomer right here, right, with the Super Nintendo and my love for the Super Nintendo and how great that system was. But 7 years, my point is 7 years, pretty big gap, right? And it's funny because video games is actually a very easy way to track that, especially the way that game consoles are developed in that kind of time span, right? Like the 5 to 7 year kind of gap. And so, if you think about it like that, like, and how long each generation of game consoles lasts, and the amount of games that come out during that time, you realize that 7 years is actually a pretty long time. And so, imagine back in ancient Egypt, you have this famine for that entire lifetime, right? Like, that would be a pretty long time. And so, no doubt that, of course, Egypt became desperate. Of course they did, right? And what were you surviving on? A fifth of what you had during the years of plenty? It would not have been enough. I mean, heck, even with half, assuming you did like 50-50, you would barely make it. So, I mean, like, you know, logically you would barely make it. So it makes you wonder how they actually managed to survive. It's one of those like mysteries, right? I mean, we just assume some kind of miracle from God, right? That they managed to survive with how little that they had. But it does kind of bring up that, like, yeah, there was a bit of a blunder on Joseph's part. I'm just gonna put that away so I'm not glowing as much. But it kind of like, I wouldn't say it's a total blunder, but obviously there were a lot of holes in this plan. So yeah, just something interesting to think about. And it's funny how the Bible just like tells you this account, right? Because you know, when you're in the Sunday school will usually just omit this part of the story because it's kind of like you don't want to talk about the embarrassing moments, right? But here it is, you know, you can read this embarrassing moment in like Joseph's governing because it's just the way that fighting a famine is. And of course, like you have to think that 7 years is a long time, so it's like, yeah, I guess with what you had to work with in the situation, right? Like you can't help but run into an embarrassing story like that. Like, fighting 7 years of famine is no easy feat. I think that's all I have to say about chapter 47. Not that much. Moving on to chapter 48. So sometime later, Joseph was told, "Your father is ill." So he took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, along with him. When Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph," when Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to you," Israel rallied his strength and sat up on his bed. So Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and there he blessed me and said to me, I am going to make you fruitful and increase your numbers. I will make you a community of peoples, and I will give this land as an everlasting possession to your descendants after you. Now then, your 2 sons born to you in Egypt, before I come to you here, will be reckoned as mine." So Ephraim and Manasseh, Jacob's still talking. "Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. Any children born to you after them will be yours, in the territory they inherit. They will be reckoned under the names of their brothers. As I was returning from Padan Aram, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan while we were still on the way, a little distance from Ephrath. So I buried her there beside the road of Ephrath." When Israel saw the sons of Joseph, he asked, "Who are these?" "They are the sons God has given me here," Joseph said to his father. "Then bring them to me so I may bless them." Now Israel's eyes were failing because of his old age. I mean, when you're 147, you can't blame the guy. So Joseph brought his sons close to him, and his father kissed and embraced them each. Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face again, and now God has allowed me to see your children too." Then Joseph removed them from Israel's knees and bowed down with his face to the ground. And Joseph took both of them, Ephraim on his right, toward Israel's left, and Manasseh on his left, toward Israel's right, and brought them close to him. But Israel reached out his right hand and put it on Ephraim's head, though he was the younger. And crossing his arms, he put his left hand on Manasseh, even though Manasseh was the firstborn. Then he blessed Joseph and said, "May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth." When Joseph saw his father placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, he was displeased. So he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh. And Joseph said to him, "No, father, this one's the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations. He blessed them that day, and he said, In your name will Israel pronounce this blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, I am about to die, but God be with you and take you back to the land of your fathers. And to you I give one more ridge of land than to your brothers, the ridge I took from the Amorites with my sword and my bow. Man, Jacob has a lot of lines, so I don't know how well I'm going to keep up that old man voice. I mean, I suppose my normal voice is already an old man voice, right? So anyway, chapter 48, Jacob gives a blessing to Joseph's sons. And, it's an interesting scene, right? So Joseph, he kind of takes the ritual, I guess you can call it, and treats it in the normal way, right? So he puts his oldest son, on his father's right side because, the whole idea that, like, the person on the right side would be, like, the more important person, right? You think of, like, in a in a in a group or like a hierarchy, right? Where you have like a leader and his main guy is called his right hand man, right? You kind of hear this like this kind of language in like mafia settings, right? The 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 mob boss has his right hand man, right? And the right hand man is like the super tough, super loyal, the other important guy, right? Aside from the main man, if you will. And so, this tradition has always been around. So because of course most people were right-handed, and the idea was that the people on the right side were supposed to be your most trusted, and since they're your most trusted person that you value them extremely highly, right? And so you recognize this, especially in a hierarchical system. And so, talking about, this scene here, of course, you kind of want the firstborn child to receive that kind of role, right? That they would be someone of more importance, right? And so that's why, Joseph, oh, they're getting these names mixed up. So Joseph, he wants, he's going through the practice in a normal fashion. But it's one of those funny things where Joseph should have seen this coming because, I mean, Joseph is part of this long line of, well, not long line, but this line of basically doing this, right? Where his dad, Jacob or Israel, he's a younger brother, yet he's the one with the main blessing. And of course, Joseph himself, being the second youngest, is given the main blessing. And then finally, so you think that, like, okay, Joseph should have known that maybe the younger one might get favored because that was true in his life and that was true in his dad's life. So it's kind of weird how Joseph acts a little bit surprised when he sees his dad doing this. Because, you think of it from Israel's perspective or Jacob's perspective, right? And of course, like, he would bless the younger one first because, that was obviously true in his own life. And so, I don't know, I just found the scene funny why Joseph expects, the normal outcome, if you will, even though his own life, as well as his dad's life, were obviously, you know, quite different from that. Sorry, I was like a little fading. I was fading a little bit there. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. I'm a little bit tired, but I mean that's what happens when you have a day job and then you have to do this. Well, I mean not like I have to do this, but you know I like to do this. So you can be super tired after, you know, you work for like 5 hours, and then you do this, right? And then you're like, oh. Sorry if I like that's not an excuse. I'm trying not to use it as an excuse, but just like try and be patient as I may zone out a little bit here and there because of my fatigue. Anyway, going back with, you know, Joseph's reaction is just a little bit weird. Just because of like he should have full knowledge that his family is full of breaking tradition, right? And so there's that funny contrast, right? Because you know Jacob is no problem. He's just like, yeah, whatever. You know, this is how it's gonna be, right? Bless the younger one. The younger one is gonna be the greater. This was true for me. It's true for you, and it's gonna be true for your sons, right? I mean, that's probably what Jacob is thinking, right? He's thinking that's how it is. And so, yeah, I don't know. There's not much else to say about that. And the other thing, too, that's kind of interesting is that in this story, Jacob decides to make the quote-unquote 12 tribes of Israel out of, well, using Joseph's sons instead of two of his own sons. And you know, every Jewish historian knows this. I mean, this is something people should just know. But there's like the 12 tribes of Israel, which is like this big deal, right? That's kind of how they're mainly divided up. Of course, to this day, technically, only really 3 of the people groups are around. Supposedly, the other 9 tribes mostly died off, or just integrated into the other primary ones. I mean, history is kind of funny like that, and there's a whole other thing that it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but I might as well do this little less history lesson about how the 12 tribes of Israel work, and we'll talk more about. Well, this will obviously come up again in the next chapter, in chapter 49, because chapter 49 is all about that. But I might as well talk a bit about it now, because I want to clarify what Jacob meant and why it's even bothered to be mentioned in chapter 48, where well, I'm trying to find the verse again. Well, it's actually pretty early in the chapter. It's verse 5. Now then, your 2 sons born to you in Egypt, before I came to you here, will be reckoned as mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are mine. And then any children, this is verse 6, any children born after you will be yours, yada, yada, yada. And so, I know some people are probably going to get a little, like, tense when I word it this way, but I don't have a better way of wording it. If you have one, please enlighten me. But it's kind of like a fable moment here, where, you know, you think of like the Israelites as they moved back into Canaan after, you know, the Exodus, right? And they're moving back to the land of Canaan, and they're divided up as the 12 tribes of Israel. But of course, the 12 tribes, you would think, would naturally just be all 12 sons, right? That Jacob has. But in actuality, the tribes were divided up a little bit differently. So the 12 tribes ended up being, and when I say tribes, I mean like the primary communities. And they ended up being Reuben, Simeon, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Zebulun, Asher. Did I mention Issachar yet? I think I didn't. Issachar, and then Benjamin, and then Manasseh and Ephraim. Now you're probably thinking, huh? That's kind of weird, right? Because those are the 12 tribes, right? But those are not all the sons of Jacob, right? Because Jacob has Joseph, this character we've been focusing on for like the last 10 chapters. And there's another son that I skipped, and his name is Levi. So you're probably wondering, well, what the heck? Shouldn't they be tribes of Israel as opposed to Manasseh and Ephraim? But of course, there was this whole thing when during the whole Exodus thing, and maybe if we do the book of Exodus next, although I kind of don't want to, I might want to do something different for January, but we'll see. I mean, if you want to do Exodus, then we can do Exodus. But if you were to read in Exodus, the tribes get divided up a little bit differently. And one of the things that God does there is he says that he wants the people of the sons of Levi to not be a tribe in particular, but to be spread out among the tribes and act as the priestly order for the other tribes, right? So you think of it this way. The other tribes of Israel are meant to act as like, the regular governance. They act like, they take the regular jobs, if you will. And the Levites, the sons of Levi, descendants of Levi, would take on the primary religious role. And so because they would take the primary religious role, they cannot operate like the other tribes do, just doing all the regular jobs. A funny contrast is that in Egypt, they already had a practice like this. We read this back in chapter 47, which I didn't talk about for some stupid reason, but I'm talking about it now, where when Joseph was buying the land from the Egyptians, he did not take any from the priests of Egypt. And it's because, the priests had this special privilege, right? And so, in the same way, the Israelites would practice a very similar kind of thing, where the priests get this special treatment. But at the same time, the cost is, well, you're not treated like a quote-unquote tribe of Israel, right? The Levites are just spread out to all the other tribes, and they perform the priestly roles, and they act as the spiritual caretakers for each tribe. So the tribe of the people of Levi are not made a tribe. And for some reason, Joseph isn't made a tribe. Instead, he's just given two through his sons, if you will. But technically, there was no quote-unquote tribe of Joseph. Oh, see, I already finished the drink now, and I still got to read 2 more chapters. But anyway, it's just one of those interesting things to think of, like, why they bother doing it this way. And so, the fable element, if you will, is that the Genesis story tells you that, like, okay, this is kind of how Jacob wanted to do it. And so he decided to make Joseph's sons and treat them as if they were his own sons. And so when they were allotted the status of tribe of Israel, then they would be given that status, as opposed to Joseph and Levi not maintaining that status for whatever strange reasons, right? Well, I mean, I explained the reasons for Levi. And Joseph's kind of a weird case, right? But I think by technically dividing it between his 2 sons, Joseph technically gets 2. But there's not 2 tribes of Joseph, right? They just say tribe of Manasseh and tribe of Ephraim. Of course, to this day, supposedly, most of the tribes have disappeared, and the bulk of Jewish people, most of them come from the quote-unquote tribe of Benjamin. That's the bulk of the people of, Jewish people to this day. The bulk of them would be Benjamin, and there would be some from the people of Judah, and then there would be some Levites here and there, right? Like those are the 3 peoples that are mainly around. So the 10 tribes have mostly died out, or merely integrated into the other, the Benjamites, basically. But like I said, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Because one, Jewish people don't care. The average Jewish person doesn't care that much. I mean, except for the rabbis, right? And they would make a deal that, like, some of them are rabbis and not priests because they're not Levites, right? That would be the only thing they might get up, like, defensive about. But say for that, like, most Jewish people really don't care. They're just like, I'm Jewish, end of story, right? And so things like a minority within their ethnic group don't matter, right? And that's a thing that's, I would say, relatively common in 2020, although it depends on who you ask, because, like, hot take of the week, I haven't done one of these in a while, but there are some people groups that are actually very serious about, like, the minority group. And when I say minority group, I'm using, like, the 12 tribes of Israel as an example, right? The 12 tribes would be the minority groups within the ethnic group. So the ethnic group would be Hebrew slash Israel, right? Well, technically, nowadays we refer to Israelite as a citizenship. So I guess ethnically they would be Jewish, right? Of course, not all Israelites are Jewish, because Israelite is a citizenship. So you can be an Arab and an Israelite, right? If you're a citizen of Israel, you're an Israelite. So that definition is a little different in the world today, right? If you say an Israelite in 2020, you're referring to someone's citizenship in the state of Israel. So you can be whatever ethnicity, right? So the ethnicity would, and the funny thing is that, like, if you were to talk about Jewish people, right? There's way more Jews that live outside of Israel than there are, I mean, I guess that's true with a lot of ethnic groups. They move out from their quote unquote motherland, right? So, I mean, the biggest place is what? The state of New York? Excuse me. Supposedly the state of New York has, like, twice as many Jews than you find in Israel. So when you say Israel, right? Well, what about all those Jews, right? Do they count as Israelites? Like, they probably don't think that they are. They think they're maybe like, well, I'm Jewish ethnically, but I'm probably American, right? So, I mean, that's another confusing thing. And obviously back in the ancient world, they didn't think this way, right? But when I'm talking about, like, a modern Hebrew, which I guess would be the closest thing to the ethnicity before Jewish became a much more, more commonly accepted word to use. But, like, the ancient Hebrews, there would be, like, the Hebrew would be the ethnicity, and then the 12 tribes would be the minorities. So like, all the members of the 12 tribes are all Hebrews, but they're all, they divide into their minority groups. And so in the world today, most people don't care about minority groups very much, right? They don't care. I mean, why bother, right? What does it matter, right? And the way that we sometimes label ethnicity, we don't bother with minority group, right? In most cases. And it's one of those funny things where, like, if you make a bigger deal out of minority group, then there's like those people tend to be leaning closer to, like, it's a funny kind of, like, double-edged sword, right? Where, yeah, you're more proud of your heritage, but at the same time, you come off a little bit more racist, if that makes sense. Because if you're making a big deal about your own minority group, then obviously you don't want to easily be associated with people of the same ethnicity because they're not your minority group. So a terrible example of this, and, sorry, I might get struck off the internet for this, but, like, when I talk about, like, I mentioned this in a couple streams ago, and I talked about, like, a Coast Salish, right? Now you're probably wondering, well, what the heck is that? Most of you don't know what that is. But Coast Salish is a minority group. It's a particular people group of what we dub First Nations in Canada. And Coast Salish people, they will make a deal out of it. You can't just call them a First Nations group or Indigenous or whatever, right? And all the acceptable terms that's been used. No, you have to refer to them as Coast Salish, right? If you're to show any real respect, you must address them as Coast Salish. You have to address the minority group. Whereas, like, you're talking to me, I'm a Chinese guy. If you just say I was Chinese, I'd be like, yeah, whatever, right? Because, okay, yeah, that's what I am, racially, right? And ethnically. My genetics, if you will, right? Like, I'm a Chinese guy, like, whatever, right? I wouldn't make a big deal of, like, see, I'm actually not even totally sure myself. of what minority group that I am. Because in the Chinese, in little bit of like Chinese history, well, not really history, but like in the Chinese culture and among the Chinese people, there's like, I think roughly 45, somewhere between 40 and 45 minority groups in the Chinese people. But really, if you ask the average Chinese guy, what minority are you? They would not know, let alone care. Right? I mean, I don't know, nor do I care. The only reason why I know there's that many like people groups is funny bit of history about myself. Is that I used to be part of um, a theater dance group, if you will. I did a Chinese dance group, and that's where I actually learned about these kind of things, because the kind of dance performances, the dances we did, were part of the cultures of each minority group, and that's kind of what you watch in a lot of these like Chinese dance performances, is that the different minority groups and how they express their culture and their individuality, which obviously was important in the ancient world, but nowadays nobody really cares, right? So that's just one example. And of course, like, other people groups, they have that tribal identity, but most people groups today, they don't really care that much. And so that's the big difference, and that's one of those funny things where like you read in the ancient world that they do make a they make a big deal out of this in the ancient world, but modern world, nobody really cares. Right? So, and I mean, why bother, right? Because like I said, there's that double-edged sword, right? If you make a big deal out of it, it actually makes you sound more racist, which, the whole thing we want to do is not be racist. So if you don't want to be racist, then you have to kind of disregard things like being so particular of your uh, ethnic minority, right? You just say, well, I'm racially this, and that's it, right? And then the rest of my characteristics is just like my individuality, right? Which is how you should judge people, right? We should judge people. Whoops. We should judge people based on our individuality, and so who I am as a person is what matters, not like you don't assume things just because I'm just some Chinese guy, right? You know me as an individual, and that's how we should treat people, right? But of course, ancient world, they weren't as as forward thinking as we were, I guess you could say, right? But at the same time, the minority mindset was how people just kind of made identity, right? Like nowadays, the way we understand identity is much more about who we are as individuals. And so, of course, the mindset that we have today is very different. And so, therefore, some things like this tribe of Israel stuff may be a little bit foreign to a modern reader. But like I said, the Bible is not the only people group that, like, the Hebrews were not the only people group that did this, right? If you read, like, a lot of, old Chinese myths, which I read a fair amount of for, because I like Chinese operas and stuff like that, then yeah, you would read that kind of stuff in that too, right? About the different minority groups and how they express themselves, right? Speaking of these Hebrew minority groups, we're going to talk about some stuff about them in chapter 49. Smooth transition, am I right? Chapter 49. Then Jacob called for his sons and said, "Gather around so I can tell you what will happen to you in days to come. Assemble and listen, sons of Jacob. Listen to your father Israel. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and my sign of strength, excelling in honor and in power. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel, for you went up unto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it.
Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter their council. Let me not join their assembly, for they have killed men in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they please. Cursed be their anger, so fierce, and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion he crouches and lies down, like a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruling staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in white, his robe in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. Zebulun will live by the seashore and become a haven for ships. His brothers will extend towards Sidon. Issachar is a raw-boned donkey lying down among the sheep's pen. When he sees how good is his resting place and how pleasant in his land, he will bend his shoulder to the burden and submit to forced labor. Dan will provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a snake by the roadside, a viper on the path that bites at the horse's heel, so that its rider tumbles backwards. I look for your deliverance, Lord. Gad will be attacked by a band of raiders, but he will attack them at their heels. Asher's food will be rich. He will provide delicacies fit for a king. Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring whose branches climb over a wall. With bitterness archers attacked him. They shot at him with hostility, but his bow remained steady. His strong arm stayed limber because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, because of your father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty who blesses you, with blessings of the skies above, blessings of the deep springs below, blessings of the beast of the breast and womb. Your father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains, than the bounty of the age-old hills. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, and in the evening he divides the plunder.
All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them, giving each blessing appropriate to them. Then when he gave these judgments,
I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah, I think that's how you say that, near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. When Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. So chapter 49 ends with the death of Jacob. And now I don't have to do his old man voice anymore. At least for today. So anyway, this chapter is a very interesting chapter and will probably be the bulk of my commentary today. Because there's just so much going on in this chapter. It's like, well, what the heck, right? We were just going through all these like story bits earlier, and now we have to go through like this long, like, what is going on here, right? So basically, Jacob divides these like, I don't know, what do you want to call them, like statements, if you will, to his sons, and clearly he has a lot more to say about some of them than others. Like, the funny part is like the middle of the chapter where he's like talking about some of his the sons of his concubines, right? So we got like Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, and Naphtali. Like, these guys only have like one or two sentences said about them, and it's all like, yeah, you're just gonna live over here, and you're gonna live over there, and you're just gonna chill out basically for the rest of your days, right? So it's kind of like, okay, these guys don't get very much said about them, but then like some of the other sons get a lot said about them, right? So his first four get a fair amount said about them, well, especially the first and the fourth one. The second and third kind of get lumped together, but I guess because they're so similar, I guess, that he felt like he only had to say, like, he could just address them both at the same time. And of course, like, Joseph gets, like, the best part, right? Like, because Joseph is the only one associated with God. That's the best way I can say it, right? Like, when Jacob talks about Joseph, he talks about, like, God's blessings and all that stuff, right? And so Joseph clearly gets the best kind of statements given to him, and of course he does, because he's the favorite, and technically he saved the rest of their lives, so I guess he gets, the best compliments from his dad. And so, yeah, the Bible's no problem just saying, like, yeah, Joseph is clearly still the favorite, right? In Jacob's dying breath, right? That he will always say that Joseph is his favorite, and that Joseph gets the best. So it's just kind of funny that, yeah, the Bible just like nonchalantly just goes like, yeah, he's gonna say great stuff about Joseph, and some of the other guys get like crapped on. Half of these guys just get like throwaway sentences of, yeah, you just live over there, right? Like, I like how Zebulun literally just has like, yeah, you'll live by the seashore, and your cities will be like ship ports. That's basically all he gets told. But the more interesting stuff, well, we'll come back to Joseph, because there's a lot to unpack with Joseph. So let's go back to the beginning of the chapter where he starts with his first son, Reuben. And of course, you'd think that it would go like a regular, you're my oldest son talk, but if you remember anything from the last chapter, obviously, like, being the oldest son doesn't mean that much, right? Especially to Jacob. Because, he himself is a younger brother and is given a better sentence than his older brother. So, no problem just ripping into his oldest son, right?
So he first gives him like the whole oldest son platitudes, right? You know, you're my firstborn. You're the representative of our family as the firstborn. I mean, that's the reason why first, you know, they make a big deal about a firstborn, you know, child, and in the ancient world, a firstborn son. That's why there's such a big deal about him, right? Because he's supposed to be the representative of the family. And so, you know, there's that beginning platitude. It's like, well, you're my oldest, you're my strength, right? You're the strength of the firstborn, blah, 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 blah. And just straight up, he just says, like, as just like turbulent waters, you will no longer excel. You're no longer going to be great because you decided to, you know, defile my bed. Like, seriously, what's wrong with you, son? Is basically what he's telling him. And he's like, because if you remember, Reuben does some kind of shift, like he does some pretty messed up things where he basically has sexual relations with his stepmom, I guess you could say, because remember, Jacob had a bunch of wives, right? So one of his stepmoms. And so I'm sure it's pretty clear that Jacob holds a bit of a grudge about that, and understandably so. Yeah, I mean, not only is someone stealing your wife, but or one of your wives, but it happens to be your son. Like, that's messed up, right? So no doubt, you know, Jacob clearly holds a grudge and is just ready to rip into Reuben, right? Just like, yeah, you're a piece of crap because you slept with my wife and your stepmom. So, like, screw you, basically. So Reuben, not so good. Then we get the next two. We get Simeon and Levi, and Jacob has no problem lumping them together, just like how the Bible has no problem going back and forth between Israel and Jacob, and why it's so easy to mix up their names. I mean, it is the same guy, but that's besides the point. But basically, he just reprimands them for being violent people. Once again, clearly, Jacob in his old age, and I mean, you could say that, like, maybe because he's on his, like, deathbed, he's just got to let out words about his grudges he's been holding against his own sons, maybe. Right? Maybe that's why he says what he does, right? He's just got to get it out there before he dies. But he's straight up like, you guys are messed up, right? Like, what's wrong with you fighting everything and being violent, right? I mean, there was the whole thing with their sister, Dinah, right? And after, you know, she had after the surprise sex, uh, yeah, like, these brothers were just like straight up murderers, right? Like, just nonchalantly, just going around knifing people, like knife mode in Call of Duty or something. So Jacob is clearly reprimanding them for their violent nature. And it's pretty clear that they were violent guys. And there's something in this passage that I didn't think about much back, you know, when I first read this. And you don't think about this too much when you're just reading this text over. I mean, first of all, chapter 49 isn't a text people just pick up for devotional and read. But, like, I remember I heard this in, like, I was in a, like, pastoral counseling. And of course, our teacher for that, our professor, he's a clinical counselor, and so he's a psychologist, and so he was talking about how this passage is interesting, the part with the two brothers, Simeon and Levi, and how, you know, in the ancient world they didn't have words for this, but we have a word for it. Antisocial personality disorder, I think it is. Basically, these guys are basically sociopaths, and very clearly so. I think it's antisocial personality disorder, ASPD. I don't remember. I think it's ASPD. And there's this passage here where it talks about how
not only do Simeon and Levi kill people in their anger, they hamstrung oxen as they pleased. And so that part there about hamstrunging oxen is basically that these guys were animal abusers. And I mean, if you're a clinical psychologist would probably easily tell you that like that's one of the earliest signs of knowing someone with like antisocial personality disorder is that they're animal abusers. And so when Jacob is pointing this out in his two sons, like we don't know, and we're pretty sure that they didn't have like those kind of understanding of psychology back then. But clearly they knew symptoms like that's messed up if you go around like abusing animals, right? That's messed up. And so sure they didn't have words like antisocial personality disorder, but they knew something was wrong with these guys, right? And anyone would be like, yeah, there's something wrong with these guys because they're animal abusers, and of course on top of that we already know that they're straight up deceptive murderers. Back to the Dinah story, not good guys, right? And clearly Jacob is holding some kind of grudge about this, and to be fair, why wouldn't he, right? If you remember back to that Levi story, the Dinah story, and Levi and Simeon kind of plotted this whole thing where they were going to kill not just the guy who took advantage of their sister, but like their whole town basically, right? They just killed most of the men, and then they took some of the women and children and took them as slaves, right? And stuff like that. And clearly, like Jacob was not happy about it, right? There was the whole thing that like, well, we got to move out now. We can't stay here because everybody's gonna hate us. And I mean, why wouldn't they? So, and here, like you read in chapter 49, like Jacob's clearly held that as a grudge against his two sons here, that their violent behavior has caused their family a lot of problems. And the possibility that these guys may be psychotic because they had the symptoms, at least one clear symptom of antisocial personality disorder. So, and for those of you who are not totally familiar with what that is, it's a form of being a psychopath, an unfeeling person to the point of being perceived as psychotic. So there's a way of looking at it is that like there's people who are selfish and egotistical, and then there are people who are really really like self-centered, and then there are people who are so like self-centered to the point that they're unremorseful and they don't feel because they cannot feel for other people, right? Because even a lot of selfish people can feel for other people, right? And that's what makes a lot of us pretty normal, right? Like we're all selfish in our own ways, but you're not a terrible human being because you still feel for the pain of other people, right? You still feel like you can give up some of your own selfishness for the interest of other people, even if it's for a little bit, right? I mean, it's not like you have to give that much, but at least you're capable of feeling that, right? Like you're capable of like, okay, yeah, I shouldn't just think about myself all the time, but I can give a little bit to someone else. Like, of course, in the grand scheme of things, we all do it to benefit ourselves because, like a guy is nice to a girl because he wants to date her. Like, on the one hand, it's like, well, there's no such thing as a guy who's nice to girls without that motive somewhere inside his being, right? That's ridiculous, right? You would never, no girl should ever expect that from a guy, right? Which is why there's that old question, can a guy and a girl just be friends? And most people would say, well, no, right? Because the guy will always ultimately think about like, at some point he wants to have a relationship with her, right? See, but at the same time, even though that like part of that is selfish, like, okay, I'm nice to a girl because I want to date her at some point, right? So that's a little like if you think of it that way, right? That's a little bit selfish, right? But at the same time, it's one, a healthy form of selfishness, because, well, see, then ultimately it's not that selfish, right? And this is what I mean by like they're selfish, and it's like, okay, yeah, obviously I'm self-interested, but it's not that bad. It's not a big deal, right? Because it's pretty normal. You should have these kind of ambitions and be a little bit, looking for your own interest, right? That's normal, right? So there's that normal form of selfishness, and even healthy, right? Because if you don't have that, right, and you would just give yourself to people, and then you would never get anything in return, and then you would just die, right? You would burn yourself out and you become worthless because anything of value, you've already given it away. So there's that kind of selfishness, which is, once again, a good form of selfishness, right? But usually we don't call that selfish, right? We would never call that selfish. Like if I were to be nice to a girl and it's like, well, ultimately, I want to have a relationship. Like no one would actually call that selfish, right? Even though if you think about it hard enough, and if you were like really technical, you'd be like, well, that's a little bit selfish, right? Because I'm still thinking about myself, right? But at the same time, I don't just think about it for myself, right? Obviously, I'm hoping that it's also an interest for them as well, right? For her as well, kind of thing, right? That, well, hopefully, she'll like me, kind of thing, right? And so I'm willing to give myself and present myself in a way that's likable for that reason. And a guy who's willing to sacrifice enough would be like, I want to be the kind of guy that she would love, kind of thing, right? And that's pretty normal, right? There's that back and forth of you being self-interested and a little bit selfish, and then of course you giving away part of that selfishness so that you can benefit someone else, right? That's pretty normal, and most of us do that. I mean, all of us do that to an extent, right? Well, I would say most of us, because once again, we move up the selfish scale, right? And so the next level would be like, we call these guys the douchebags, right? Like the guy who goes around sleeping with multiple women because he thinks he's got all the game and he thinks he can do whatever he wants. But at the same time, he is aware, but simply views himself as like, well, I deserve it, right? That is what we would call selfish, right? That, oh well, I deserve it anyway. Like I can take advantage of people because I deserve it. But these guys tend to be aware enough of other people's feelings, but they're just the kind of asshole that they tend to justify their crappy behavior and say that like, no, I'm better than you anyway. So, you know, and I know guys like this, right? Like they're like, well, so what? If I can have multiple girls because I'm a person worthy of that, as opposed to what, some Asian nerd who sits in his basement talking to people on the internet and reads Bible stories on YouTube. And what kind of loser does that, right? Clearly, a guy who sleeps around with multiple women is clearly like, oh, I'm better than this guy anyway. So why should this loser in this basement, have any chance with any girl? Why don't I just take multiple of them, right? And there are guys who think like that, and more often than not, people justify that kind of behavior because why not, right? I mean, what positive qualities does that Asian nerd in the basement actually have, right? Oh, he's smart. He knows how to read, but like, okay, what other good is he, right? So some guys can justify that, like, well, they're scumbags to women because, well, at least it's better than something else, right? And so there's that rationale, but at the same time, these guys aren't so unfeeling, right? And then, oh, sorry, before I move on to the next group, and these guys we would actually consider pretty selfish, right? The guy who puts down other people, but they do it because a lot of it is also their inner insecurity, right? That they feel they have to show that they're better than someone. And because they do that, they're actually self-conscious of what other people think and feel. And therefore, they don't actually possess antisocial personality disorder. They're just scumbaggy because they do the opposite. They keep behaving the way they do because they're aware of how other people feel. And so they have to validate themselves by saying, well, no, I'm better than, this guy preaching in his basement, right? I'm better than him, so I'm going to behave like an asshole and then, sleep around to show that I'm a better human being, right? That I'm a real man. I'm not just some nerd who sits in a basement, right? Now you're all probably thinking, man, why is this guy just like self-deprecating himself so much? But I mean, I've heard it enough from other people, and it does, like, it stings, but that's the way it is. And the reason why, like, I try not to make, like, okay, yeah, I get it, right? Like, I can see why guys treat me like crap, right? Because their insecurity, but at the same time, I can empathize and sympathize with guys like that because I understand that they have that feeling and they're not unfeeling, right? They're really selfish because they're overly sensitive about their own inadequacy. And at that point, I just feel pity, right, for guys like that. Of course, it doesn't mean that I would justify their behavior, but at the same time, I know guys like this, and if you're ever watching this, I pity people like you, right? But at the same time, you're not beyond hope because, you're not you don't possess ASPD, so, your clinical certificate there, you're not crazy, right? You're just a jerk. But then we get to the crazies, right? And there's a difference of guys who try to overcompensate, which is really what it is, and then guys who just they don't think of any kind of consequence because they're mentally removed from it. And that's why people treat it like a mental illness, right? Because there are some guys who are, quote unquote, mentally incapable of making that gap, right? Between I treat people like a jerk for my own validation, right? And so there's that nuance and that difference. Of course, the big problem is that some people with antisocial personality disorder, they know how to mask it and hide it pretty well, right? So it's not an easy thing to catch. So, but the big difference between them and, the jerk who always puts you down because he's inadequate is that these people are actually incapable of feeling. They're incapable of actually having that sympathetic moment with their victims. And so I know I'm not explaining this very well because, one, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I mean, a clinical psychologist could easily explain this to you better. But what I'm getting at here is that, it's not that these things were not around. And clearly in something like the Bible, they were aware stuff like this was around. They just weren't sure what to call it, right? And of course, part of it is like that old, that archaic language, right? Like, the Bible may call it sinful nature. Some, in Buddhism, they call it crap, what's it actually called? It's like when you're completely devoid of the pillars, right? Of the 4 pillars of Buddhism, and you're completely devoid, and so you only pursue the desires and completely disregard the pillars, right? Of that balance and even moving away from the desire, right? Which, in Buddhism, desiring is the reason why suffering even exists, right? And so ancient philosophies and religions all had different ways of trying to understand, things that we would call modern psychology. And so the point I'm getting at is that, like, it's not like they weren't aware of these things, right? Just because of the ancient world doesn't mean they're so primitive they didn't know stuff like this was around. But at the same time, they didn't have words for it, right? Like, I'm pretty sure antisocial personality disorder was not a real term back then, right? So in the Bible, they would have called stuff like that part of the sinful nature. Of course, when the Bible talks about the sinful nature, they try to, it's kind of like a throw-all word, right? And it kind of encompasses all these kind of different things, which is why the sinful nature, in talking about it in this way, is problematic, right? Because the sinful nature can apply to all kinds of things, right? Because once again, there's the guy who puts you down because he's inadequate and has to feel like he has to validate himself, but he is aware of other people's emotions. He's just so insecure about his own that he has to shut down other people's. And then the sinful nature would be called sinful nature. And then people who do similar actions but are incapable of feeling for other people would also be thrown under the sinful nature, right? So that's why when we use like the sinful nature and like in Christianese, right? There's that problematic nature to it, and understandable, right? But it's not like they weren't. What I'm getting at is that it's not like they weren't aware stuff like this was a thing, right? They just didn't have the words for it. But you can clearly see here in Genesis 49 that like Jacob is aware of it, and he's aware that's why his sons are so messed up, right? That they may be borderline psychotic. And it makes you wonder, like, making a quote-unquote tribe of Israel out of a psychotic person like this. But whatever, I guess, right? I don't know. I just wanted to focus on that little bit of information there, because it was an interesting thing when I heard it the first time. About how, yeah, Simeon and Levi may possibly be psychotic, because they show a symptom of it, which is being animal abusers. So, because no one quote unquote hamstrung oxen as they pleased, right? Like nobody just does that, right? Because once again, oxen are useful labor animals. You don't just abuse animals just for the sake of it, especially in the ancient world, because that could cost you a lot of money, right? See, a selfish person would think, or a regular selfish person, if you will, would think, no, I'm always going to keep my animals well protected because that's my money, right? I'm going to protect my money, right? And I'll do everything I can not to ever hurt it, right? To hurt my investments, if you will. But, if you're going around hamstringing animals because you think it's fun, yeah, clearly there's something wrong with you. Because normal selfish people think rationally, right? And thus, probably don't hamstrung oxen. But if you do that as you please, quote unquote, and then of course these are the same guys that Jacob is also saying, well, you're super violent, your anger is so fierce, fury is so cruel. Like, yeah, not guys you want to be around. And of course, you have to reflect back on the Dinah story, right? Like, these guys came up with such a sinister plan to go basically kill a bunch of other guys, right? I mean, on the one hand, we may think, well, they're justified in doing so, but at the same time, it's like, okay, like, yeah, surprise sexing your sister is a bad thing, but at the same time, it's like, you don't just go around slaughtering guy after guy after that, right? Like, that's crazy, right? You don't just go around murdering people. Because, two wrongs don't make a right. I mean, it's more than just two wrongs at that point when you're slaughtering, like, guy after guy, right? So, clearly, Simeon and Levi, not good guys. And clearly, Jacob is calling him out for it. So, every right to. So, just a lot of things interesting to think about these two. Now, the next one we have here is Judah. Now, Judah is an interesting one to study because, there's this one part where most Bible commentaries would talk about how there's a little bit of prophetic or prophecy nature in the part where Jacob talks to Judah, and this whole thing about, like, somewhere in your line, there's going to be, like, this great king. And, of course, supposedly, we talk about how, like, oh, that's, the prophesying about Jesus and the Messiah, right? And all that. Which is true to an extent. But I think people overplay that in some ways, right? Like, obviously, of course, in Christianity, the crux is Jesus. So, of course, we're going to make a big deal about how, like, yeah, there's a little bit of, like, hinting of the coming of Jesus in Judah's statement, or the statement to Judah. But at the same time, it's not like that doesn't automatically make the statement to Judah the best one, if that makes sense, right? Because as I pointed out, like Joseph clearly gets the best statement. Like Jacob has the nicest things to say to Joseph, even though the stuff to Judah is still pretty good, right? But of course, once again, there's the other thing too, where Jacob brings up the, how do I put this? He brings up, when Carson lies down. Like, sure, he kind of brings up this whole thing, like the messianic vision and all that, but at the same time, he still brings up some of the more like darker sides of Judah, if that makes sense, right? About, you know, sure, we talk about the lion, you know, we associate the animal figure of the lion with Jesus, and that's obviously true for its own reason. That, of course, a lot of people forget that Jesus is described as a warrior, especially in the book of Revelation. Not so much in the Gospels, right? But in the book of Revelation, Jesus is clearly a warrior. And so there's still that violent side that is brought up with Judah. And Judah, in this whole statement to Judah and talking about the coming of the Messiah, and this is probably where the big misconception comes in, if you will, about the Messiah when Jesus actually came 2,000 years ago, right? When, you know, during the Gospels, and why everybody made a big deal about Jesus being this like conquering figure, right? And that when he was to be the Messiah, he was going to overthrow the Romans, right? And this passage does have some to do with that, because, you know, this whole warrior language, right? Being the lion and taking down the prey and being a leader and all that stuff, right? And so you obviously have images of like a military warlord and a conquering king, right? Which, yes, it's also, it is true that like Jesus is definitely that in the book of Revelation. But, you know, one of the big misconceptions was that like, well, when there's supposed to be that, how do I put it? That harmony between God being a parent as well as a fighter. But when this whole message, this whole statement with Judah talks about the Messiah, it only talks about the fighter part, which I guess is fair. It's only fair. And I mean, Jacob probably had to, you know, after blowing his steam about his other two violent sons, he was still having that whole like violent mindset. And so he would bring up these kind of elements more to the forefront. I don't know, that's just a thought. But at the same time, I know a lot of people say like, well, Judah gets the best statement just because it's talking about the Messiah, which is not necessarily true. That's what I'm trying to get at. Because, you know, let's jump to Joseph, because we don't need to talk about the other sons that much. It's kind of, they always just get these like, you're going to live in this place and you'll be fine. So not much really happens with these guys. But then we get to Joseph. And, you know, there's a lot to say about Joseph. So first, Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring, whose branches climb over a wall. Yada, yada, yada. Skip a little bit. Because of the hand of the mighty one, referring to God, Jacob the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, once again referring to God, the rock of Israel, because of your father's God, now at that point you're just being blatant, who helps you. So Joseph gets to be, you know, associated with God in that way, that God is a direct influencer in Joseph's life. And so Joseph has that spiritual power, if you will, not clearly seen. And once again, this leads to that misconception with Judah, and maybe why people thought the Messiah was solely like this political leader. And you can definitely blame this passage for that misconception, because, you know, they would have, the Messiah is only described here as a very physical being, right? there's nothing spiritual about him. Whereas in Joseph's case, when Jacob is giving a statement to Joseph, excuse me, when he's giving the statement to Joseph, Joseph, it's a very spiritual experience, right? And Joseph has the spiritual encounter with God. So clearly, like, Joseph is awesome, right? That's what Jacob might be getting at here. Like, clearly Joseph's awesome because he has a spiritual encounter with God, right? And so that's the main reason why I would say, and I think anyone would really say, that Joseph gets the best statement from Jacob, because he's the only one that actually has a spiritual connection with God, which is ultimately the most important thing, right? Because sure, you can get all the blessings of living in a nice land or, whatever. But if you have that spiritual connection with God, like, your life's in the right place. And I mean, that's obviously true, right? And so, once again, that's another obvious reason to think that Joseph gets the best statement from his father, because... Let me turn this light off. See, now it's too dark. Maybe if I turn this one up and turn this one up. No, see, that's too much. See, there's like no perfect balance of this. Let me try this again. I'll turn this one back on. I'll turn this one up a bit. And then I'll turn this one up a bit as well. Maybe I'll turn this one down. If I turn the screen off, I probably won't. Yeah, see? Well, the screen doesn't affect it that much because I have a dark background. So it doesn't matter all that much. But, sorry, I got off track there. But clearly with like this spiritual experience, and I mean, once again, it is important, and I'm not downplaying that. I mean, you shouldn't. I mean, that's the crux of religious life, if you will. And so that's the main evidence I will use in regard of like why Joseph clearly gets treated the best. It's not just because, he's the favorite son of Jacob, although that obviously is a factor as well. But I think it's because Joseph has a spiritual experience, if you will, that he's the best one, right? Which is funny because, in contrast, if you read through most of Joseph's story, right, minus the whole dreams thing and the whole power to interpret dreams, which Joseph himself says comes from God, and there's no reason to doubt that, but minus that, we actually have very little, like, God is hardly mentioned in Joseph's story arc. And that is the main thing I kind of want to talk about with, one of the important themes of the Joseph story, or the Joseph arc, or the Joseph story, is that in actuality, there's very little contact with God, as opposed to like Abraham, no doubt, right? Like with Abraham, God had a very relaxed relationship with him. Isaac, not so much. Jacob had, one major encounter with God, and then maybe like another couple of them with like, at Bethel, which is why Jacob named the place Bethel, right? So it's funny because in comparison to like Abraham and even his own father, Joseph has very little like connection with God in that way. There's very little of that kind of contact. God is never, like, if you look through the Joseph story again, God does not have any lines. He doesn't have any lines of dialogue. Not like with Abraham, and definitely not with Jacob. Right? God has no lines of dialogue. In a way, he's almost absent in some ways. Right? And I made the joke about how, like, when Joseph was living in Egypt and when he became the governor, he embraced a lot of the Egyptian culture, and you don't have this moment where God like reprimands him for it or anything, or God forces, the Egyptians to completely change their worldview. Nothing like that happens, right? And so the only thing, it's kind of only implied that that Joseph has direct contact with God. It's only implied because of the whole dreams thingy. But save for that, there's very little to none of an actual quote-unquote spiritual experience between Joseph in God. And that's something very interesting that the book of Genesis actually ends this way. And we'll read in chapter 50 that once again it's like very little to none of interaction between God and Joseph. And that's something that I always thought was kind of interesting. That there was this lack of interaction. And the funny thing is that like Joseph has a lot of chapters. So you would think that there would be some kind of like, God shows up and talks to him or something like that. You would think that would happen, especially when you have basically nearly the most chapters. I mean, Abraham and Joseph tie for, I think Joseph actually has like, no, I think Abraham, they're roughly tied. I think they both have like roughly 11 chapters. And so, in the book of Genesis, and so Abraham has so many interactions with God. So why doesn't Joseph have more of these kind of interactions, right? I mean, with Isaac, at least we can give him an excuse. He only really has like 3 chapters of him being the central character. And so, okay, 3 chapters isn't very much, right? But I mean, with Abraham, like in the first chapter he's in, right? Or second chapter, because he does show up at the end of chapter 11. Like in chapter 12, Abraham has immediate contact with God, right? God just goes up to him one day and says like, yo, you're moving out, right? Whereas like with Joseph, you don't really see that, right? All you get is like the dream sequences. And once again, sure it's implied, but it's not direct, right? It's not like outright the Bible tells you that Joseph contacts God in this way. And the reason why I bring this up, in so much detail is because I think it's kind of ironic and a little bit humorous because of its irony that Jacob, talks about Joseph in this very spiritual way, even though, like, in the grand scheme of things, not that much, right? I mean, I guess it's definitely more than the other brothers. We'll go with that, right? There's Joseph being a spiritual person far more than his brothers. Like we just talked about how like, 2 of them are probably unfeeling sociopaths. So lack of spiritual encounter there. But like with Joseph, even the implied spiritual encounters, I guess, is more than the other guys, right? So maybe that's what, why Joseph gets to talk about him in like a spiritual way, even though just by reading the text, you don't really see that. Because once again, everything's implied, right, with Joseph. But I just found that a very interesting observation, that Joseph is treated in this very spiritual way, despite the fact that his spiritual encounters with God are all implied. And thus, you could even make the argument that he doesn't have these spiritual encounters, right? Of course, once again, people would say, well, that would be contrary to what the Bible says, because, Joseph himself says that his ability to interpret dreams comes from God. But, I mean, that's just an implied thing. And even if that, even when that is true, it's not that much if you want to try and put like a quantitative quality to it, right? It wouldn't be very much. Like, it's definitely not the relationship that Abraham had with God. It's not the same relationship that Jacob had with God. Definitely not. So it's not a lot. Joseph doesn't have a lot to go off on, and yet Jacob still describes him as being like the most spiritual. It's just kind of funny to think about. Finally, we have the last part of chapter 49, and that's where Jacob dies finally, because he's like super old. He's like, it's one of those funny things too, where we read back in Genesis what? Before the flood. So like what, Genesis 6 or 7 or something like that? Before the flood, like God's like, well, I don't want people to live too long past the age of 120. And yet we have like all the patriarchs live well beyond this. Like Abraham lives like 180. Isaac lives to about 150 something, and here's Jacob living to like almost 150, right? So God bending his own rules, I guess. But I mean, he can do whatever he wants. So I mean, what you gonna tell God what to do? Be my guest. But it is kind of funny that he does bend his own rules with stuff like this. Because yeah, Jacob lives longer than the average. Well, the life expectancy that people should be living, according to God's own words. Another funny observation, but I mean it's completely rational. Where like when Jacob's talking about like this place where his ancestors are buried. Excuse me. And then he talks about how like, okay, so my grandfather was buried at this place, my dad was buried at this place, and of course their wives were buried at this place. I want to be buried at this place, but we didn't we buried my first wife there, but we didn't bury my favorite wife there. It's kind of funny because, well, I mean, it makes sense too, right? Because the Bible does tell you Rebecca died on the way to Canaan, and so it's more than likely that like you don't want to be carrying a dead body around for that long. So they obviously buried Rachel a lot earlier, and then Leah kept living with him, and probably the two blah 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 concubines. Although it's not mentioned where they're buried, but I guess Leah does get her justice in the end, if you will. After being a neglected wife for probably a big chunk of her life, Leah gets her justice that she gets to be buried as if she was his official wife. So, and I've mentioned in the past that Leah's that character that like you feel really sorry for. But it's kind of funny in this passage that like Leah is the one that gets to be buried with him, right? Because Leah is already buried in the place where his parents are buried, and Jacob says, "You will bury me there as well," and Leah is buried there waiting for me, basically. And so I kind of have this funny little thought about how like Leah gets her justice, right? Because being the neglected wife for as long as she has been, and she's the character you feel sorry for, she at least gets the honor of being treated like his main wife, even though like Jacob did not favor her as she wasn't his favorite wife, that's for sure, but she gets the special treatment here to be buried with him. And I think that's kind of like a poetic justice, if you will. But I mean, at the same time, you're not going to drag a dead body a long distance, so they buried Rebecca a lot earlier when she did die. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that chapter. So actually, I mean, what do you mean that's all I have to say? There's a lot to say about chapter 49. All right, let's read chapter 50, and then I'll just kind of talk about some overall themes in Genesis, and then we're in the stream. So, I mean, that will probably be like another like half an hour. So, we're almost near the end, guys. We're gonna make it to the end of Genesis after like 13 weeks, something like that. Alrighty. Chapter 50. So Joseph threw himself on his father and wept over him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in the service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, and that was the time required for embalming. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days, which is a pretty long time. I mean, 70 days is like almost a quarter of the year. It basically is a quarter of the year. Let's see, days, 365 days. No, sorry. 70 days is a fifth of the year. Well, my math is bad. Not a quarter. A fifth. It was roughly a fifth of the year, which is still pretty long, right? I don't know why I thought only a quarter. 1/5 of the year they spent mourning for this guy. Because, right, 90 days is a quarter, more or less. 70 days is like basically a fifth. A little bit less than that. Because 350 days. So then you have to add another, like, you would divide out of fives, right? So 73 days would be a fifth of the year. So it's just shy of a fifth. When the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, "If I have found favor in the eyes of Egypt, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him, my father made me swear an oath, and said that I am about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. So let me go up and bury my father, then I will return." So Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear to do." So Joseph went up to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, the dignitaries of his court, and all the dignitaries of Egypt, besides all the members of Joseph's household and his brothers, and those belonging to his father's household. Only the children and their flocks and herds were left in Goshen. Chariots and horsemen also went up with him. It was a very large company. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad, near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly. And there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "The Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning." And that is why that place near the Jordan is called Abel Mizraim. I think that's how you say that. Abel Mizraim. So Jacob's sons did as he commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt, together with his brothers, and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. Now when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to hurt me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, and also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid." And I don't know why I did an old man voice. I guess because Joseph's super old, so we're going to keep doing it. "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up from this land to a land he promised an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said,
God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place.
So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And that ends the book of Genesis. So Genesis 50 is pretty short. Just about how they mourned for Jacob / Israel. And then, of course, Joseph's death, right? And then basically, the Bible does this like huge time skip. Excuse me. The Bible does this massive time skip when we get to the book of Exodus. Because then like 400 years pass, but that's besides the point. So basically, Genesis ends with Joseph's death, because, I mean, Joseph was the last major character. So we're going to end it with his death. I guess that was a completely rational way of doing things. But of course, a lot of people lay the focus on that little bit in between the two deaths in this chapter. And that's the scene where Joseph's brothers come up with this great plan to basically write a fake will, I guess, from their father, that Joseph would, you know, forgive the other 10 brothers. And by extension, you know, getting them off the hook. Of course, here, Joseph just sees right through the ruse, but he's like a nice guy about it and says, like, hey, you know, like, I got to spend these 17 years with our father, which is good enough, you know. Life's been good for us. You know, you don't have to worry about that anymore. It's basically what Joseph tells his brothers, and especially when we talk about 17 years, I mean, that's 12 years after the famine ends, right? So that means Egypt has probably been plentiful again for 12 years. And, you know, that means, and especially in those 12 years, you know, Joseph would have lived, and the whole family would have lived their lives pretty well. And so, you know, after all that, why would there be any reason for Joseph to care, right? But that's the interesting little contrast that you see in this short exchange, is that, you know, some people are stuck in the past, the brothers, and Joseph only looks to the future, right? Once again, it's kind of what makes him virtuous, right? Is that Joseph is a man who lives for the future, and so that's why he's able to do what he does. And so, you know, this leads to his profound statement, right? And you probably hear this statement mentioned every time the Joseph story is mentioned in church. And it's the part where, let me just find the exact verse. It starts on verse 19. I'll start reading. I'll read it again. So Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to hurt me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And so, you know, you intended to hurt me, but God intended it for good, right? So it's a very different kind of mindset, right? Now, of course, this is a great way to end Genesis, if you think about it, right? Because, you know, if you remember when I started talking, you know, I started doing these Genesis readings. You know, one of the major themes is that, one of the major points I made was that Genesis was a book of prophecy, and it's meant to look into how Israel should live for the future, right? Even though, yes, Genesis technically is also a historical book in some ways, right? But it's more about looking to the future. And that's how we should treat the entirety of the Bible. And that's kind of what Genesis kind of prompts the reader to do. And I mean, especially if you take the Mosaic tradition context, right? That, let's say Leviticus was probably written first, right? Well, you know, assuming Moses wrote it. Leviticus, and then so the Israelites would have had the law. And then, well, how do we really live up to the law, right? That's the $60,000 question. So, the $64,000 question. is, you know, how do we do that? How do we live up to this law? And ultimately, the book of Genesis, how it tries to answer that question is to say, you live looking to the future of what God can do, right? That's how you should live, right? And the law is just there to kind of help you out and kind of give you, you know, a guideline to it. But ultimately, the point of the law is to try and live, you know, for the future and what God has in store for Israel in the future. Primarily, if you want to look at the, you know, the Pentateuch context, moving into the land of Canaan, into the promised land, right? And looking to the future. You know, don't dwell on the past, right? You're meant to dwell in the future. And so Joseph's closing statements here really show that, right? Because once again, the brothers still live in the past. You know, they're worried about Joseph hurting them because their father's not around anymore. And they're still talking about like the pain that they've caused Joseph. And Joseph is aware of this. He says, well, yeah, you intended to hurt me, but, you know, God intended me to save lives. And that's what matters, right? And so because of this, this is how Israel, the land of Israel, was supposed to think. Now, when I talk about Israel, I'm going to talk about like the people group, not Jacob. Because I mean, that's how Genesis transitions, right? So the people of Israel are supposed to look to the future and how to, you know, be God's ambassadors, or whatever language you want to use, right? Basically to represent God to the world, right? And to save lives in that sense, right? The spiritual saving, right? How are you going to do that, right? Well, you know, you take a step at a time, but ultimately that needs to be your focus, right? And then you'll pick up the practical skills on your way, right? But you need to have your eyes set to the future as opposed to being so fixated on what was before, right? And that's the ironic thing about the book of Genesis, right? Because, you know, because it has a creation story in it and all that stuff, right? People get so caught up in all the past factors of it. But the book of Genesis, the point of the book of Genesis is to point the people of Israel, and by extension, you know, the people of God, even to modern Christians, you know, how to move forward. How do you look and live your life looking to the future, and, you know, ultimately how to represent God as you move into that future, right? And so Joseph gives you his answer, right? To save lives, the spiritual saving of lives, right? Because that's ultimately what Christians should be doing. And so that's the real point of the book of Genesis, was to say, well, that's you should always be looking for how to save people, because it ain't easy though, and you have to, but it ain't easy. You have to because the world is a crazy place that needs God, and it ain't easy because the world is a crazy place that needs God, right? So, but at the same time, just because that's true, you know, don't be disheartened, right? God intends things for good and will bring you to save lives, right? In the grand scheme of things. I mean, that's the ultimate, that's part of the hope, right? And so that is the point of Genesis. And so when you look back on these guys like Abraham and Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and all the other side characters, right? When you look at all of them, that's what you're supposed to see. You're supposed to see that God is beginning this journey of saving people, because that's what God wants to do, right? Because, you know, the whole, well, we all fell into sin because of Adam and Eve, and clearly human beings have this darker nature, as we learned with Cain and Abel. But at the same time, God wants to save us, right? And it ain't going to be easy, right? But that's ultimately the goal. And so how does God move forward into that goal? And by extension, how do we, the people of God, move forward to that goal, right? Of course, I mean, you know, it's easy to look at that on hindsight, and you can just read other parts of the Bible to get your answer. But, you know, if we were just to read about, or sorry, if we were just to talk about what Genesis was trying to do, that's the kind of mindset you need to put yourself in, right? And the kind of questions you really need to ask yourself is, okay, well, where's my place in that, right? This whole big plan of, God wanting to save people. Well, where's my place in that, right? Where do I fit in that, right? And that's not a question I can answer for you, right? That's a question you have to. That's a question you have to continuously seek out yourself, and you will continuously find new avenues that you have to dive into. That's part of the journey of life, right? And everyone's life is this crazy journey through Canaan, if you will, right? And the world is just a crazy place, but at the same time, God is working His goals in your life, and that is something that we have to always be mindful of. And once again, that's the importance of reading Genesis, is that it has to keep us mindful of that. Because it can be easy to lose sight too, which is another thing that Genesis is a good reminder of. Anyway, that's all I really have to say. So I'll just kind of give some closing note. Well, I mean, I gave most of my closing notes about Genesis in general, but I mean, with all that philosophical stuff I just kind of hammed at you, and definitely watch this video on a playback to really think about it more. But this is why these kind of philosophical implications and stuff to really think about is why I think Genesis is such an important book to read, right? Because this translates to every aspect of life, right? The wondering of, well, where is my place in life, and what does God even want to do with it, right? Like, why, what for, right? And to constantly ask yourself that question and ask God that question, like, why did you put me on this earth, right? That it ain't something that's gonna come easy, but it's something that must be wrestled with basically all the time. And Genesis is that reminder. It's that anecdote of that, right? Using the patriarchs as the examples, right? And of course, that's the beauty of them being relatively normal people. It's because these statements about, like, well, what do I do with life, and what does God want to do with my life, and how does he intend it for good, and blah blah blah, right? And so on. Well, when you look at the patriarchs and other characters in the book of Genesis, you're supposed to be like, yeah, that is true in my own life as well. And so that's all the more reason, to think about and pursue God in that sense, right? To know. And that is the search, right? And it ain't easy. And I mean, to the contrary, God says it's gonna be the hardest crap you do in your life, basically. So in another book. But the point of Genesis is that it uses this anecdotal version to kind of make you aware of that question. And so the next question would be, well, where do we go from here, right? Now that all these questions are brought up, well, where do we go from here? And that's where, I mean, there's 65 more books in the Bible, right? So after Genesis, and you got to read through the whole thing, right? To get your answer. And I think that's why I really like Genesis, because you can talk about these kind of things, and it's a very real approach, because we all still ask this question to this day, right? I mean, you'd be worried if people weren't asking these kind of questions, right? But at the same time, I think by understanding the world building Genesis did, then you can really think about it in any kind of context. It doesn't just have to be like the ancient world context, but it can be applied to our lives in 2020, right? And moving on to 2021. Wow, it's weird to think it's going to be 2021 soon, but like, with that being said, as you move to the future. Well, what is the intent? What is the intent of your life, right? And if you keep that outlook of, well, God will intend it for good, well then hold your head up high and move forward toward that. Anyway, that's the end of that super serious talk right there. So this is the end of the book of Genesis, and I hope you guys enjoyed the read through Genesis. I'll just wait a couple minutes if you have any questions. If not, I'm going to end the stream real soon. My throat is super dry. As you can tell, I drank that cup of fruit juice way too early. Maybe I should just bring like the entire gallon or something. Well, I mean, at that point, it'd be unhealthy. Just loading that much, like, fruit punch into your body. Not a good idea. But at the same time, my throat is dying now. So I'm going to end the stream really soon. And I mean, thank you for putting up with me this long, right? So, anyway. Just give it a couple minutes if you have questions. I'm just gonna look at something here while I give you that time, and then we'll end the stream soon. Let's get rid of this thing. Don't need that. I know it's super annoying. You can hear all my mouse clicks, right? Well, if there are no questions, this will be the end of the stream. Oh, I guess I'll do a little bit of housekeeping. So, for next week, and what we have set up for next week, the plan is Monday, I'm going to do a Christmas reading for you. I'm going to do a reading stream, do some kind of Christmas story, and, you know, have a grand old time with getting into the spirit of Christmas, right? You know, a funny story, I was at a little coffee shop today because I had to get some coffee, pump my system with that. It's unhealthy, I know. But, like, I go get some coffee, and I was in the store, and because I haven't been out for the last couple days, it's like, oh, right, all these places are, like, playing all the Christmas tracks. And you don't think about it that much until, like, oh, yeah, you know, you're actually there, and you're listening to, you know, Winter Wonderland or whatever. And it's like, wow, yeah, I mean, really in the Christmas mood, right? So that was kind of neat. So, you know, Monday stream, we're going to get more into that Christmas spirit. And I'll be reading you a Christmas story. And then after that, we're going to move out of it as I finish Tokyo Mirage on Tuesday and Wednesday. Probably Wednesday stream, because it's going to take me 2 streams to do it. So Tuesday and Wednesday will be Tokyo Mirage, and then Thursday will be Throwback Thursday. I'll be continuing StarCraft Brood War. I think I'll be starting the 4th level of the Zerg campaign, because the 3rd one took me like most of the stream time, because it was funny, the first 2 levels took me like less than an hour, and then the 3rd level took me like 2 hours. So, that was rough. But next Thursday, Throwback Thursday, and the next Friday, I will likely do a Bible read on the birth of Jesus story, because it will probably be the last one of the year, because on the 25th of December, probably not streaming for obvious reasons. So yeah, that's the look of next week. Another thing too, if you guys have not already been watching, I have started uploading quote-unquote regular videos on this channel, and I am doing a Let's Play of Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and the Blade of Light, or as I awkwardly title them, Sword of Light. But I, you know, I'm used to an old translation patch which called it the Sword of Light. But besides the point. I'm doing a Let's Play of Fire Emblem 1. So definitely check it out if you're into, maybe I'll introduce you to like that genre, the turn-based strategy, which I do like, and I am a Fire Emblem fan, so no reason not to play it on my channel. So definitely check that out. So I got those videos I'll probably upload almost every day. Most days I'll probably do an upload. I gotta do an upload after this stream of the next episode. So, aside from the stream schedule next week, I also have regular videos, which I know is like super taxing on me because well, right now work has kind of picked up because it's like, we're just doing end of year stuff and clearing out all that, before the new year starts. So that's a thing. And then of course, like trying to do these streams pretty regularly. It ain't easy, but I try to do it for you guys. And so, hopefully you guys, keep up with the regular streams as well as the new uploads of videos that I do. With that being said, this is now the end of the stream. And I hope you guys enjoyed reading through the book of Genesis with me. And I will see you guys next week. Hope you guys have a great weekend. And God bless you.